Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grimflayer. Hope you're all doing very well today, and we are going to do some on-the-fly deck building. This is the post-ban and unban deck tech for my stock list for Golgari Midrange for BG the Rock, and we're going to do the changes kind of, off the cuff, on the fly. I have thought about these. I have referred to some notes. I've written some notes to which I will refer to be more accurate, but I have not seen how it all comes together. So this is going to be a window into my deck building process, and this is going to result in the list that I'm going to begin testing with in the wake of the Hogaak ban, the Looting ban, and the Stoneforge unban. If you want to see why my meta predictions are the way they are, and therefore why the changes are being made to this particular list, you can see my previous video on the post-ban meta predictions. But assuming you've watched that, let's begin building our decks. So what you're looking at here is the last list that I played through a league on the Rock on the channel, besides the one where I kind of mashed up my list in Paranobles 5-0. So this was the latest iteration of my Rock list, and as you can see, it's pretty significantly warped toward the graveyard decks. We not only have 2 Spellbombs and a Cage, we also have 2 Extractions, 4 Plague Engineer, and Liliana the Last Hope, lots of ways to kill those X1s. And we also are concerned about the Eldrazi-tron Menace, so hence the testing one of Liliana's Triumph. And also we've been on 7 discard spells as a way to punish the linear decks that had been prominent due to having to race the Hogaak decks, and discard also being very effective against Hogaak in general. So that's kind of why the list looks the way it does, but we're going to change it. We're going to change it pretty radically here, and you're going to see me do it right now. So the first change I want to make is we're going to bring in a Kalitas. Kalitas is going to be a hedge against the fairer decks, the mid-range decks packing Stoneforge Mystic. He's good against the decks where the creatures actually stay dead when you kill them, and he's good against graveyard decks as well, of course, if you can untap with him and then have some interaction in hand. He's also very good, of course, against burn as well, and a little bit of a hedge against Tron specifically, just because he's good against Wormcoil Engine. Tron is kind of a matchup where you can win it with a ham sandwich, if you're disrupting well enough. So the fact that the lifelink isn't that relevant, the fact that it's only a 3/4 for 4, well, it's still got upside in Tron. So I think Kalitas is definitely very well positioned, and this is a pretty radical change. It's not a like-for-like change, but we are going to replace an Inquisition of Kozilek with Kalitas. I think the window for us to play 7 discard has probably gone. Not that it's not viable anymore, I just don't think it's quite as optimal as it was pre-ban and unban. So we're going to go back to a more traditional 3-3 split. Despite expecting a Rise and Burn, I am going to continue playing 3 Thoughtseize because on the Rock, we have not gotten issued a new toy like Abzan with Stoneforge or like Jund with Ren and 6, so we need to play even more to our deck strengths than we once did, in my opinion, and we need to play a lot of bombs. We need to play a higher density of bombs that take over the game. Those are my philosophies with these changes, and that's why we make that first change there. Next up, I'm not going to do this in any particular order. We're just going to go through the changes as I have them jotted down as they came to me as I decided they were good. So over here you see 0 copies of Collector Ouphe. I have never not been high on this card, and I'm still, even when I had 0 copies, I was still high on it. I just said, I'm not seeing that many artifact decks. The ones that I am seeing, we can beat without the Ouphe. But I have never said the Ouphe is badly positioned ever since he came out in Horizons. And now we're going from 0 in the most recent iteration all the way up to 3. That's right, we're playing our bombs, we're playing our hard hate pieces. And if you saw my previous video, I expect a Rise in Tron, a Rise in Wurza, and a Rise in Affinity and Hardened Scales affinity, both traditional and Hardened Scales. Ouphe is the man against all of those decks. We're going to play 3 copies. So how do we make room for this this wonderful, wonderful, mischievous little Ouphe? Well, we're going to cut Grafdigger's Cage. I think this is overall, in our archetype, the weakest of the graveyard hate cards, and in general, we don't need as much graveyard hate. Decks like Dredge are often playing Blast Zone. You know, most decks that are soft to cage have good ways to answer it. Collected Company... If Collected Company rises, we might bring it back, but I don't necessarily expect Coco archetypes to rise up in the wake of the ban so much. Also, if Neoform becomes a major problem, Cage will be a good one to bring back in. But I think our Neoform matchup is fine. So I think Cage is a fairly free cut. And we are also going to hedge away from 1 copy of Nihil Spellbomb. I think I will basically always play at least one of this card, but we're going to try to free up a little bit more slots, move away from the graveyard stuff. It's good against Jund these days. It's good against control decks, so I'm always happy to keep one. It's arguably still our best single card against graveyard decks, but we're going to cut one, and we're also going to cut Liliana's Triumph because we do expect the Eldrazi decks to be falling a little bit further out of the meta, and it's just not the very best card in Modern in general. It's a fine one. It'll basically always be playable in my book, but we are going to hedge away from that because we're bringing more Ouphes. We need more and more Ouphes. We can never have enough, right? So, moving on, another hate piece whose stock has risen markedly. Extremely, extremely high on this card, more so than I have been since it was printed. Ashiok Dreamrender. So why am I high on Ashiok right now? Well, it's because Ashiok is supplementary graveyard hate in a meta where we no longer need graveyard hate on turn 1. Like, the turn 3 graveyard hate may actually be relevant again. We already have some of it, of course, in the form of Scooze. You know, you discard turn 1, you play Scooze turn 2. That's all well and good. But Scooze was like our slow graveyard hate, our long-term, long-game-oriented graveyard hate against those decks that needed to be supplemented by Spellbombs and Surgicals and Cages. Now I'm hoping that Scooze and Ashiok, with a little bit of assistance from a reduced number of those quicker effects, is going to be sufficient against graveyard decks, and Ashiok is going to be an awesome, awesome hedge against the rise of big mana. Very, very good against Tron. Game-winningly good if they cannot answer it against the Titan decks, whether it be Amulet Titan or Valakut. Ashiok is a major pain for them, so I believe Ashiok has arguably seen the highest rise in its stock relative to any of the other cards we're going to be bringing into the fold here, or continuing to play. Ashiok was a card I couldn't really justify in the pre-ban meta, but now I think Ashiok is pretty darn good. And the fact that it's got incidental hate against search effects, incidental, hate against value out of the opponent's graveyard means that if you're ever in a position where you don't have enough cards to bring in, Ashiok can be a make-weight. Ashiok, you can bring this card in and it's fine, even when it's not at its best, right? So you like having some number of those in your sideboard. It's just, if you're not sure what the meta holds, if you're not sure whether your deck is 100% refined, the not bad option is not bad to have, right? So fortunately, we do have to cut something to make room for Ashiok, and I think the 3-drop slot is just getting very, very crowded. I'm a huge fan of Liliana the Last Hope, always have been, but does not feel like now is the perfect time in the meta for her because she doesn't kill Stoneforge Mystic. We've got a lot of other X1 hate with our Plague Men, and we've got a lot of other things like Ren and 6 in the format also hating out X1s, reducing their presence overall. And the fact that she ticks down for value and then ends up at 1 is also bad against Jund, against Ren and 6 in particular, right? So, and finally, we all know very well how this card performs, very well how good she can be, what she does, so it's a known quantity. We can afford to side her out for the sake of testing, and we can always bring her back if that's what we want, right? So that's the change. Ashiok in, Lily the Last Hope out. Now, speaking of X1 hate, Dark Confidant. So we have to walk a fine line here because Dark Confidant has more Predators than he has arguably ever had before in the Modern format. And again, we also expect the rise of Burn and maybe other aggressive decks too, where his life loss can be a huge liability. However, I also believe that we are now clearly the best Dark Confidant deck in the format. We leverage him better than any of the 3-color decks simply by virtue of our relatively painless land base. So we need to play to our strengths. Dark Confidant remains a strength, for sure. Still one of the best cards in our deck, despite the fact that it's a little tougher out there for him these days. Therefore, I will hedge away from the full 4 down to 3. And in terms of what comes in for him, there's 2 options. Number 1, Vraska Golgari Queen, and number 2, Courser of Kruphix. I have not even made a final decision on this. I figured I'd talk it out in front of the camera here and see what's what. But I think right now I am leaning more toward the Courser, simply because I'm a little uncomfortable playing 2 4-drops main deck, especially because we're still on 3 Bob. You know, we still want to keep our curve nice and low, and we are going to keep the Unearth in, so I kind of like having a high density of 3 drops that can be bought back with Unearth, right? Vraska is very, very nice, but again, suffers from the problem of, specifically if we're thinking of the grindy value, which we always should with these value-oriented planeswalkers. We're thinking of that against Jund, the fact that she ends up at 1 loyalty and is very pingable by Wrenn and 6 after her Abrupt Decay effect goes off. Yeah, I'm not so sure that she's as well positioned as she could be. That said, you know, if we are correct about Stoneforge Mystic decks taking off and Eldrazi decks falling by the wayside, Abrupt Decay in general is going to be better positioned than it has been in a while. Keep that in mind for later in the video, but for now, I do think I'm gonna keep experimenting with the Courser of Kruphix. We'll maybe play without Vraska. If Courser proves to be too much of a trap card or a bait card, you know, looks better than it is, it's too dirtily, we'll very happily cut it for a different value-oriented permanent. But right now, I like a lot of what it does. It hedges us against Burn, hedges us against aggro. It is a consistency tool in that it helps us churn through the bad top decks. It even helps us manipulate the top deck in tandem with fetch lands. It's got some cute upsides, like if it goes to the graveyard, it's an enchantment to help grow the Goyf. And the 2/4 body is nice. It outsizes Bloodbraid Elf. It outsizes a lot of the aggressive things of the format. You know, if you got some bears on the field and the humans are attacking you with like 2 3s and 3 4s and 3 3s, Courser is a very good blocker there. So I am willing to give this card a more extended run as a one-of. It was fine when we saw it in the mashup league, right? It was pretty cool. So, and of course Vraska also gives you life gain. So it's not like we're missing out on the life gain from Vraska though, because of course Courser does that as well. So this could easily be a Vraska. But for the reasons I just mentioned, I think we're gonna try Courser in place of the Bob. Now, I did just mention how good Abrupt Decay is seeming, but Assassin's Trophy is also seeming very, very nice as well. Because, of course, we need to attack the big mana decks. We need to be able to disrupt Tron mana. We need to be able to hit a Karoo land, an Amulet Titan, when that makes sense to do. We need to be able to kill Titan itself when that makes sense to do. And, of course, Trophy, while it's not always the most efficient option that you could possibly register, it is basically never dead. So, obviously, it's a tough call. Like, do we play a second Decay over a third Trophy? Or do we just say, yeah, our 1 Decay is going to be better than it's been, but we're just still going to stick with 1? Well, why not both? Why not both? So, if we wanted to add another Abrupt Decay, then we would be playing 3 Decay and 2 Assassin's Trophy. 2 Decay and 3 Trophy. Now, obviously, something needs to make way for this. So, basically, there are 2 thoughts that I've had. Number 1 is we could cut away our Maelstrom Pulse. And even though I absolutely love Pulse, nobody loves Pulse more than me, truly. That makes some sense because we are kind of heavy on the 3-drop permanents. Therefore, it kind of makes sense to lower our curve a little bit with the interaction. And then we have max synergy between our Unearth and our permanents. We have a reasonable curve, and all that is all well and good. The other option here is to cut a copy of Hexdrinker, because Hexdrinker is a 1-drop, but in many matchups it is for all intents and purposes a 4-drop. We also have the X1 factor that we mentioned, how it is vulnerable to a lot of things. It can be very clunky. And that said, it is very unique in the deck, but I've had my suspicions for a while that Hexdrinker would be purely optimal as a 1-of, because you almost never want to see 2 unless, you know, you have to run out your first one out of desperation into destruction, and then you also want to draw the second one later in the game. That can come up, right? But that seems like the other potential cut to me. We're not messing with the lands, by the way. I think the land base is really good. I really like Urborg. This experiment has paid off for me. I don't see the need to change much else. Hissing Quagmire is looking a little bit worse these days than it was a little while ago, but I still like it for just pure consistency. Yep, not much more to say about that. So we're not adding or cutting a land. We need to figure out, though, if we are going to play the second Decay, which I think we are, whether we cut Pulse or Hexdrinker. So let's count our threats in the main deck. Let's assume we're going to cut Hex. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, plus an Unearth. That's on the higher side of threats, so there we go. We're going to try only one Hexdrinker. We're going to keep playing the trusty Maelstrom Pulse, which I really have always loved. Just such a nice catch-all. Good X for 1 potential as well. So those are our changes to the main deck, and some of the sideboard changes. Now, there are a few other cards on my mind that I don't know exactly whether we're going to play. This has been a lot of changes already, but I'll show you the cards that may or may not make the cut in the near future. The first one is Obstinate Baloth. So this card had a very impressive moment in my recent Sultai League, and even in the tournament practice lobby games, had some really funny moments, like getting it on my turn 0, the opponent's turn 1, off of a Burning Inquiry against Hollow One. That was pretty hilarious. But, you know, if we do expect, if it does come to pass that Liliana of the Veil decks go up in meta share and Burn decks go up in meta share, you could do a lot worse than playing this card in your deck. I don't think I'm going to add it right now, but I want to point out that cards like this are on my radar. Another card that's back on my radar, more so than she has been in a while, is Nissa Vital Force. Definitely just goes over the top of a lot of the Stoneforge Mystic decks. It outsizes Batterskull. It's just good against those types of decks in general. Good against control. Good in the attrition-based matchups. And like I said, we might be at a stage where we're more incentivized to play the bombs. So Nissa is a card I'm actually more high on than Baloth at the moment. I'm going to put her over here to see if maybe we can get her in. And the final one that I will mention here is lots of cards with the name Eternal, but this one is what I'm thinking of, Eternal Witness. Now, just in terms of helping to kind of fix the wrong half of the deck problem by buying back exactly what you need, even buying back lands is better now because we're playing more bombs. It's a higher curve. We do have 2 trackers in the deck, so buying back a land can be gas, or you're just buying back whatever threat the opponent will find it toughest to deal with. Eternal Witness is always a card that is playable in the Rock, in my view, just as a 1-of. I usually don't make room for her because it just seems like we can never quite justify it. I still maybe can't really quite justify her, but I do want to point out that she is on my radar. She's almost something that made the cut here, but ultimately don't really think there is necessarily a slot for her that jumps out to me. But if you have other ideas, my friends, you know, maybe you don't think Courser is good enough, maybe we could play a Witness there. Or maybe we could play the second tracker main and have the Witness in the sideboard for grindier matchups. Tough to say, but I think she could in theory be in the mix, competing with cards like Tracker number 2, Courser number 1, Plague Man number 4, right? So let me know what you think about that, and I guess just for the sake of discussion, I'm going to leave my sideboard like this. We're going to leave it at 16 cards. I really like having the second Tracker in the 75. Feels a little bit weird to have one main and one side, but I actually kind of like that. I like one Plague Man main, 3 side. As you all know by now, I am hugely high on the Plague Man. I like playing the full 4, especially if we're following the player bombs philosophy. Plague Man is one of the biggest bombs our archetype has access to, make no mistake. So Yeah, it's really tough to say exactly what the configuration should be, but in terms of the main side split for this stuff, it might look a little haphazard, but I think it's fairly nuanced. I think it's served me fairly well. But yeah, why don't we just call it 16 cards with a sideboard? And, actually, I'm sorry. I actually have a plan for this. We only need one Surgical Extraction now. That's my plan. We're paring down even more on the Graveyard Hate. We do have stuff that can flex into multiple different matchups. So yeah, what if we just look like this? Are we too value-oriented? Well, I don't really think so, because if you look at the value pieces that come in from the side, it's really only Nissa and Tracker, and you can also put, especially because Fulminator is not good against Jund anymore due to Renin 6, right? But if, against Control, if you want the value against Control, you bring in Fulminator. If you can also consider Plague Engineer a value piece, but of course this is more for hosing the weenie decks, right? But honestly, I think cutting a Surgical is fairly fine, and I think playing the Nissa is also fine. So we still might be a little bit soft on the Graveyard Hate. We only have now one Surgical, one Spellbomb, one Ashiok. That is not that much, but remember this. Remember that Plague Engineer also is very good against Dredge, and against other all-in graveyard decks, I don't even know what they could be. But let's say like Living End, for example, we're kind of hopeless against Living End to begin with, so I don't think like a second Surgical makes a difference against Living End, really, if they're functioning, right? And remember this also, we also have main deck Kalitas now, which we didn't before, and still on 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze. So I believe that this is enough Graveyard Hate if we are thinking that the slower stuff is more viable than it was, much more viable than it was before the ban. So this is what our deck would look like. Anything else we want to touch on? Those are the changes. If you think I should bring back a card I cut, if you think one of the more fringe cards I identified, like Witness or Baloth, deserves a spot, or something I didn't even speak about at all, please, my friends, let me know. Vraska could also be in the mix as well. She really could be. But yeah, so just to go over the deck quickly as a wrap-up, we do have 23 lands. Our utility is 3 Field of Ruin, 2 Nurturing Peatland, 1 Quagmire, 1 Treetop Village. This gives us, I believe, at last count, 18 black sources all day. Let's double-check that. 4, 8, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17... That's right, 18 black sources, which is enough to consistently, 90+% of the time, cast Liliana of the Veil on turn 3. You also have a slightly higher number than 18. Let's call it like 18.1 black sources on average, simply because Urborg can turn an otherwise 1 black mana hand into a 2 or 3 black mana hand if you have it. So Urborg has been really nice, fixing the mana in that way, making Peatland produce black painlessly. As mentioned, the Hissing Quagmire doesn't feel quite as good if we're expecting Eldrazi to fall out of the meta, and, protection effects can mean it doesn't trade that well with the Stoneforge decks either, but, it's still a fine card. It still is a value-oriented card that also gives us that 18th black source to make our mana consistent. And I think we can afford 2 ETB tapped lands. Treetop Village is the better one now, though, for sure. For Fatal Push, pretty non-negotiable, as mentioned. We're on the 3-3 split, back down to 6 discard. We mentioned Unearth. I continue to like exploring this as a one-of. Gives us some really nice tempo advantage by returning a 3-drop that gets discarded out in a mid-range mirror, or that just dies, like unearthing a tracker and then following up with a land and still being able to take actions, or even just start cracking clues is amazing. Hexdrinker. I already mentioned the pros and cons of this card. It's still a really hard one to rate. I've had some really good feel-good moments with Hexy, but we are down to 1. We're going to see how that goes. We can always bring back the second if we need to. Note that we still have a main deck Collective Brutality now. I think more people might have been moving away from this than is good for them, simply because it is such a Swiss Army knife. It helps fix the wrong half of the deck problem, and a lot of people either aren't playing it as much or they're playing all their copies in the side. I understand that, but I still think we lose some equity with the card if it's in the sideboard. And it almost makes me wonder, like, if you're sideboarding it, maybe it should just be like a Weather the Storm and a Brutality rather than 2 or 3 Brutalities in your side. But I think, conceptually at least, it is a main deck card as much as it is a sideboard card. The escalation can be really relevant in game 1, where we have some cards that are not so great before we get them out in the sideboard. As mentioned, 3 Dark Confidant, which along with Collective Brutality, these are all nods to the aggressive nature of the format. And 3 copies of Scavenging Ooze. So we are the best Bob deck in the format. We are also the best Scooz deck in the format. All of our interaction puts stuff into the graveyard, unless Kalitas is around, I guess. And we have a ton of green mana, and it's mostly painless. This means we can leverage Scooz really well, and I think some other BGX decks might say we can pair back on the Scooz, we can go back down to 2 now that Hogaak and Looting are banned. And that's true for them, but I think Golgari should be leveraging this as a really high-value piece. This is one of our best cards, and I think we should still be playing 3 because it's just that good in our deck. 4 Tarmogoyf, non-negotiable. As mentioned, 2 Decay, 3 Trophy. I really like this. We'll see how it goes, but it feels great to have 6 of these effects on paper in this configuration. The main deck, Plague Man, gotta love it. It's a game winner, even on its own, even main deck, even when you wouldn't expect it to be, and we've got 3 more on the side. You're not going to see me going down from 4 on the rock anytime soon, I don't think. For Liliana the Veil, she seems even better positioned than she has been now that Looting and Hogaak are banned. Now's the time to jam your 4 of Lily, in my view. Definitely can't go wrong doing that. We've got 1 tracker in the main, 1 on the side. This is still one of our best cards. It's felt really good lately when I've played it in a variety of BGX decks. Rock, Jund, Sultai, it's felt really good in all of them. Has some real single-handed game-winning moments from the tracker. Never underestimate how powerful Flood Insurance is. It's tempting to say Modern is so linear, Modern is so ruthless. You cannot afford Tireless Tracker because it's just too slow. But look, we make the game slow. We make it slow with our discard. We make it slow with our catch-all removal. We force them to spend removal on other must-answer threats. And before you know it, the game's going very long. And also remember that not every deck fires on all cylinders every time. So if both decks kind of have suboptimal progressions and the game just gets really dirtily, Tracker is such inevitability. It's insane. It does everything you want. It's a game-ending proactive threat, and it draws us a bunch more cards. What's not to like? So we'll be experimenting with the 1 of Courser of Kruphix. I could see this going either way. Really depends on the meta more than anything. We talked about that. We're keeping the Pulse around, which feels great. We talked about Kalitas, and the 2nd Brutality, 3 more Plague Men. We've still got 1 Surgical Extraction. It is a nice graveyard hate piece in conjunction with other effects. It flexes into combo matchups very, very well. And, of course, it is nice alongside Fulminator Mage against Tron and other big mana archetypes. Speaking of which, we still have 3 Fulminator Mage. If anything, I would be tempted to play the 4th if we are expecting the big mana prediction to come true. But Tron is the big baddie of the big mana, and we do also have 3 Collector Ouphe, so that would probably be overkill to play the 4th Fulminator, but if we end up wanting to cut an Ouphe, but big mana is still a huge issue, maybe we do play the 4th Fulminator. But until then, we've got 3 Fulminator, very good against control, good against other mid-range, just not Jund, and then of course Ashiok, as mentioned, looking very, very nice at this moment in time. We've still got the Spellbomb, which does a good amount of work in a lot of matchups, and you're never really sad to see it when you bring it in. Replaces itself, right? We've got 3 Ouphe, we've got the 2nd Tracker, and we've got Nissa Vital Force because we're adopting more of a mentality of playing our bombs, and Nissa can break the control matchup in half, can break mid-range mirrors in half, and is a fine threat against big mana decks, simply as a 5/5 haste with utility is how you should think of her in those matchups. So anyway, my friends, that was me making several alterations to the previous iteration, the pre-ban and restricted update iteration of my stock Golgari mid-range list. I hope this was fun to see. I hope the kind of on-the-fly deck building process was entertaining and was informative. As always, we're all in this together. We're all the good guys of Modern together. So let me know what you think about all this, and I look forward to hearing your comments and suggestions. I might take them into consideration enough to implement a change or two before I play a league with this. So if you feel strongly about something, please feel free to let me know. Until then, this has been the September post-ban BG Rock Deck Tech. If you are enjoying this content, check out the link below to Patreon, which is where you can support me and earn tier rewards for doing so, enabling me to keep bringing you this content with as much regularity and as much expertise as I am capable of. So thanks again for watching. I will talk to you soon, and check out my the next video on this channel, the Abs and Stoneblade deck tech. See you around.